There's a reason why some people enter any environment and are immediately respected, while others spend their entire lives trying to prove their worth without ever truly being taken seriously. And the uncomfortable truth is, almost no one loses power due to a lack of talent. Most lose power because they talk too much, give too much of themselves, explain too much, and allow themselves to be emotionally consumed by anyone who shows the slightest attention. Machiavelli understood something the modern world tries to hide all the time. Those who are always available end up seeming replaceable. Those who try to please everyone end up forgetting their own worth. And those who live seeking approval inevitably surrender control of their own minds to others. The problem is that many men have been taught to believe that excessive kindness breeds loyalty, that absolute transparency generates respect, and that always being present makes someone loved. But politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows exactly the opposite. The man who sells himself cheaply accustoms the world to treating him as something cheap. The man who over-explains reveals insecurity. And the man who never sets limits silently teaches others to cross them all. Perhaps you've already felt this without realizing it. That strange feeling of always being available to everyone, but almost never truly valued. That feeling that the more you give, the less respect you receive. As if you were chasing something that never fully arrives. And this is precisely where almost everything changes, because the most emotionally strong men aren't the most aggressive, the richest, or the loudest. They are the ones who have learned to control access, silence, presence, and emotional reaction. Men who have understood the calculated use of force. Men who have stopped begging for understanding and started building value silently. In this video, you will understand the 7 psychological power tricks that completely transform how people see you, without cheap manipulation, without motivational theatrics, and without needing to raise your voice. Because in the end, the man who truly possesses value doesn't chase validation. He becomes impossible to ignore. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul. An invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There's a silent error that destroys the value of many men without them realizing it. They believe that by giving too much, they will be remembered, respected, or loved. But real human nature rarely works that way. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago when he said that politics guided by reality, not ideals, always reveals something uncomfortable. People value what they earn more than what they easily receive. A man who is always available, always helping, always yielding ends up creating expectation, not loyalty. And expectation is an infinite emotional debt. The more he gives without criteria, the more others begin to consider it an obligation. That's why many good men end up tired, resentful, and confused, wondering why no one recognizes all they've done. The problem was never generosity itself. The problem was the absence of limits. The man who gives everything too early teaches others to consume his energy without respect. And the worst part? When he finally decides to stop, he's still called selfish because he accustomed everyone to unrestricted access. It's brutal to realize this, but extremely liberating as well. Notice how this appears in common situations. The person who responds to messages immediately, solves everyone's problems, pays for everything, accepts any invitation, always helps people out, is almost never truly respected. Often they are merely convenient, and convenience doesn't generate deep admiration. It generates use. There's a huge difference between being loved and being useful. Machiavelli spoke about avoiding being hated, but he also understood that excessive, uncontrolled kindness weakens the perception of authority. Better to be feared than loved doesn't mean becoming an arrogant tyrant. It means understanding that respect is born when people know that losing your access will have consequences. Think of someone extremely competent at work. The person who solves everything for everyone usually receives more tasks, not more recognition. But the one who delivers value with discernment creates weight in their presence. This happens because the human brain associates scarcity with value. What is rare seems important. What is too abundant loses impact. That's exactly why needy people try to buy affection with excessive giving and end up receiving emotional crumbs in return. A strategic man understands that intelligent generosity is different from self-abandonment. He helps, but doesn't sacrifice himself to be accepted. He gives, but doesn't turn his life into an emotional supermarket open 24 hours a day. Virtue and fortuna walk hand in hand when there is self-awareness. Even in the business world, this is evident. Premium companies don't beg for attention. They filter clients, maintain a strong position, and don't lower their prices every time someone complains. The wise man does the same with himself. He understands that the calculated use of force also appears in silence, in absence, and in the ability to say no without guilt. And curiously, when he stops selling himself cheaply, people begin to perceive him differently. Some distance themselves, of course, because they never truly liked him, only the easy access they had. But others begin to deeply respect him, because they finally see someone who no longer trades his dignity for cheap validation. And that's exactly where a new problem arises that almost no one is prepared to face. What happens when you decide to close the gates that have always been open? The man who lets anyone into his life without criteria usually calls it humility. But often it's just disguised fear of rejection. He accepts conversations that drain his energy, tolerates minor disrespect just to avoid conflict, and grants emotional access to people who haven't even proven they deserve his presence. Machiavelli understood something that remains brutally true. That which has no boundaries quickly loses value. A castle without gates doesn't convey welcome, it conveys fragility. And curiously, people sense this in behavior even before they rationally perceive it. The man who is always available, always accessible, and always too easy rarely inspires deep respect. Because unlimited access eliminates mystery, eliminates weight, and eliminates consequence. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, demands understanding that limits don't drive away the right people. They only reveal who was there for convenience. The problem is that many men have been taught to believe that imposing limits will make them cold, arrogant, or difficult. So they continue living like an open field where anyone enters, steps on something, takes something, and leaves without even looking back. In practice, building selective boundaries completely changes how the world reacts to a man. Consider someone who only responds to messages when truly able, who doesn't accept every invitation for fear of being alone, who doesn't try to impress every new person who comes along. There's a different kind of calm in that demeanor, and that calm communicates power. Better to be feared than loved. In many cases, simply means not allowing your emotional needs to become visible to everyone. Because excessive neediness always weakens your position. Think about professional environments. The employee who accepts everything immediately usually receives more pressure, more abuse, and less appreciation. The one who knows how to negotiate time, priorities, and space transmits silent authority, not because they shout or impose artificial fear, but because they demonstrate that their attention has a cost, and anything that has a cost tends to be valued. A simple example: men who learn to say, "I can't today," without making excuses, begin to notice something strange. Some people get irritated, others begin to respect them more, because for the first time they encounter someone who doesn't live for the approval of others, and this profoundly affects human dynamics. There's also a dangerous detail that almost no one notices. The more emotionally open a man is to anyone, the more vulnerable he becomes to subtle manipulation. Excessive exposure reveals patterns, insecurities, needs, and emotional triggers. Strategic silence protects. The appearance of virtue often requires intelligent discretion. It's not about becoming paranoid or cold as stone. It's about understanding that not everyone deserves access to your mind, your plans, and your weaknesses. Strong men build their own loyal armies around them, not opportunistic crowds. And true loyalty takes time to be tested. Observe highly competent businessmen, disciplined athletes, or respected leaders. Almost all of them share a common characteristic: limited access. They don't explain everything, they don't constantly justify themselves, and they don't let just anyone cross their emotional boundaries. The calculated use of force also appears in the ability to close the door without guilt. Because those with constant adaptability understand that protecting their energy isn't arrogance, it's strategic survival. And when a man finally learns to control who enters his life, he realizes something even more powerful. Silence begins to be worth more than any explanation. Few things convey as much power as the ability to remain silent while everyone around feels a desperate need to speak. The average person believes they need to explain everything: their plans, their pain, their next steps, their intentions, and even their deepest feelings to people who wouldn't do half the same for them. Machiavelli observed real human nature with brutal clarity, and therefore understood that information is power. Those who talk too much reveal the entire map of their own minds. And the problem isn't just appearing predictable. The problem is that predictability facilitates control. The person who reveals every emotion on their face, every frustration in their voice, and every insecurity in their words ends up offering free ammunition to those who know how to manipulate them. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires understanding something uncomfortable. Not everyone who listens to you is rooting for you. Some are simply gathering information, and this happens in friendships, relationships, professional environments, and even within the family itself. The impulsive person believes that absolute sincerity always brings people closer, but often it only reduces their strategic value in the eyes of others. There's a huge difference between being authentic and being emotionally uncontrolled. The wise man speaks with intention, not anxiety. He understands that excessive words usually stem from emotional neediness. Those who constantly need to prove their worth end up over-explaining themselves, and those who over-explain themselves are deep down trying to buy acceptance. Observe truly respected men in any environment. They don't compete for verbal attention. They don't interrupt every conversation to boast. They don't announce every objective before acting. There's precision in the way they speak. There's weight. Better to be feared than loved. In many cases, appears precisely in this calm unpredictability. Because the silent man forces others to observe more. And those who observe more usually control the environment better. A simple example of this appears in negotiations. The nervous individual tries to fill every second of silence by talking too much and ends up revealing their insecurities. The strategic man, on the other hand, uses pauses as a psychological tool. He understands that silence creates pressure, And pressure reveals much more about others than endless speeches. This even happens in relationships. The man who reacts immediately to everything becomes easy to read. He who knows how to remain serene creates presence. But there's something even deeper happening behind all of this. Silence doesn't just protect your image, it protects your mental energy. Most people are so busy trying to be understood that they never realize how much emotional drain there is in constantly justifying themselves. The strong man doesn't feel the constant need to convince everyone around him of who he is. An appearance of virtue doesn't mean falsehood. It means understanding that emotional maturity requires intelligent discretion. Virtue and fortune favor those who control their impulses, because the calculated use of force is rarely noisy. The most dangerous predator in the forest doesn't announce its moves before attacking. And in modern life, this translates very practically. The fewer people who know exactly what you intend to build, the less emotional interference you will suffer. Many projects die not for lack of ability, but because they were exposed too early to mediocre, pessimistic, or envious people. The wise man learns to work in silence until the results speak for themselves, because results create a kind of authority that arguments will never be able to create. And when someone finally learns the value of silence, they realize something even more powerful. Controlling words is important, but controlling emotions can completely change the game. There's a reason why emotionally reactive men end up being manipulated so easily. They believe they're just being honest, but in practice, they're handing over the steering wheel of their own minds to anyone who knows how to push the right buttons. Machiavelli deeply understood that decisions based on real human nature require emotional control above almost any other skill, because the man who explodes too easily, despairs too quickly, or demonstrates anxiety all the time becomes predictable. And predictability is an invisible prison. All it takes is for someone to understand what triggers your anger, your fear, or your neediness. And suddenly you're being led without realizing it. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows something hard to accept. The world respects more those who maintain stability under pressure than those who lose control in the face of it. This doesn't mean becoming cold or insensitive. It means not allowing momentary emotions to dictate permanent behaviors. The man who doesn't tremble in the face of chaos sends a very powerful silent message. You don't control my inner state, and few things are more intimidating than that. Observe how manipulative people operate. They provoke, pressure, ignore, test limits, and create small emotional situations just to gauge your reaction. Not because they care about the situation itself, but because they want to find out how far they can push you emotionally. The impulsive man falls for this every time. He responds immediately, sends lengthy texts, tries to defend himself, raises his voice, loses focus, and delivers exactly what the other person wanted: a reaction. Better to be feared than loved often simply means not offering emotional entertainment to those who want to destabilize you. Think of a professional environment. The disorganized boss creates pressure, and the emotionally weak employee panics immediately. The emotionally trained man, however, slows down, breathes, observes, and responds precisely. This completely changes the power dynamic. An extremely practical example. Before responding to a message that triggered anger or anxiety, wait. Go for a walk, exercise, drink water, listen to music, or simply be silent for a few minutes. It seems simple, but this pause destroys destructive impulses. The strong man understands that whoever controls the timing controls a large part of the game. And emotional timing is priceless. There's also something almost invisible happening when a man learns not to show despair. People begin to project strength onto him, even without him saying anything, because emotional stability has become rare in a world where everyone reacts to everything immediately. Virtue and fortune favor those who maintain clarity while others collapse emotionally. Even the calculated use of force depends on this. An emotionally uncontrolled warrior is dangerous even to himself, and in modern life this appears in small details. The man who doesn't beg for attention, who doesn't engage in pointless online arguments, who doesn't turn every frustration into a public drama, and who doesn't feel a constant need to prove something to everyone around him. The appearance of virtue also involves composure, not because he is perfect, but because he understands that indiscriminately exposed emotional weakness attracts opportunists. And curiously, when a man stops reacting impulsively, he begins to realize how many situations lose their power on their own. Many conflicts survive only because they receive continuous emotional fuel. But there is an even deeper consequence when someone learns to master their own emotions. They finally begin to build a life where they don't depend emotionally on anyone to feel whole. The needy man lives negotiating his dignity without realizing it. He accepts emotional crumbs, tolerates petty disrespect, and desperately clings to people, jobs, or opportunities because deep down he feels he has no alternatives. And when someone believes you can't live without that, the balance of power immediately disappears. Machiavelli understood something that remains frighteningly relevant today. Excessive dependence weakens any man. Having one's own loyal armies has always been safer than depending on the protection of others. In modern life, this means building such solid internal and external resources that no single person becomes the absolute center of your emotional stability. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, demands understanding that true freedom is born from the ability to survive without needing to beg for permanence. The man who is emotionally dependent on everyone lives in constant fear of losing. And those who live in constant fear end up accepting humiliating conditions just to maintain what temporarily reassures them. This is precisely why so many intelligent people remain in destructive relationships, toxic environments, or miserable jobs for years. The most dangerous man to lose isn't necessarily the richest, the most handsome, or the most famous in the room. Often, he's simply the most complete internally because he's built enough skills, discipline, emotional independence, and adaptability not to collapse when someone leaves. Virtù and fortuna favor those who learn to become a resource for themselves. Look at men who dedicate years to quiet personal development. They learn to invest money, take care of their health, develop communication, improve their appearance, control their emotions, and build professional competence. Gradually, they stop operating from a position of scarcity, and when that happens, something profoundly changes in how the world treats them. Better to be feared than loved in many contexts means just that. People realize you won't be desperate if they decide to leave. An extremely practical example of this is in relationships. The man who abandons friends, dreams, routine, purpose, and identity for the sake of a single person conveys immediate emotional weakness. The one who maintains his mission, his habits, and his direction conveys stability, not because he loves less, but because he didn't abandon himself in the process. And interestingly, this often increases respect within the relationship. There's also a truth that almost no one speaks clearly about. The more indispensable a single thing becomes to your happiness, the more vulnerable you become to fear. And silent fear destroys decisions. The wise man diversifies his sources of emotional and material value. He builds wealth, develops multiple skills, strengthens his body, expands his knowledge, and creates a routine that doesn't revolve exclusively around the validation of others. Calculated use of force also means creating a life where your absence has real weight. Companies do this all the time. Strong brands don't desperately chase any customer because they know the value they deliver. The strategic man learns to do the same for himself. He stops chasing cheap approval and begins to invest in making his presence rare, useful, and difficult to replace. The appearance of virtue without substance crumbles quickly, but silent competence creates lasting authority. And when someone finally understands this, they begin to realize something uncomfortable. Many of the rules that governed their life were never truly chosen by them. They were imposed by fear, need, and conditioning. And that's exactly where the next rupture is born. Most men never realize they are living a script written by others. They choose professions to please their families, mold their personalities to be accepted, hide their opinions to avoid rejection, and spend years obeying invisible expectations without even questioning whether it makes sense to them. Machiavelli understood that decisions based on real human nature require the courage to contradict collective approval when necessary, because those who live trying to please everyone inevitably lose themselves in the process. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that society rewards conformity on the surface, but deeply respects those who have their own direction. The problem is that almost no one can bear the discomfort of disappointing others, so they continue to accept unbalanced relationships, jobs they hate, and reduced versions of themselves just to maintain temporary peace. But there is a silent price to pay. Every time a man ignores his truth to preserve acceptance, he weakens his own identity a little more. And fragile identities become easy to control. A strong man doesn't announce a change in attitude like someone campaigning for an election. He simply changes, without long speeches, without needing to convince anyone, without turning personal evolution into an emotional spectacle. The appearance of virtue often requires strategic discretion. Because talking too much about new boundaries before upholding them only creates unnecessary resistance, the wise man understands that real boundaries aren't defined by pretty words, but by the willingness to lose something to defend them. Better to be feared than loved can often mean having the courage to displease people accustomed to controlling you emotionally. And this appears in extremely practical situations. The man who decides not to immediately respond to every message. The son who finally stops accepting emotional manipulation disguised as concern. The professional who stops accepting silent abuse at work. The friend who begins to distance himself from environments that diminish his ambition. In the beginning, many will complain, because they were used to the obedient version of him. But little by little, something changes. People begin to realize that this man is no longer negotiating his identity to be accepted. And this perception completely alters the dynamics around him. There's a reason why independent men bother certain people so much. They break invisible patterns of control. The predictable individual can be easily led, but the man who thinks for himself becomes difficult to manipulate. Virtue and fortuna favor those who possess constant adaptability without losing their essence. And this requires emotional courage. Because living by one's own rules means accepting that some doors will close. Some people will distance themselves, some criticism will appear, but it also means something much more valuable. Finally breathing without feeling like you're acting all the time. The calculated use of force isn't just in direct confrontations. Sometimes it appears in the firm silence of someone who simply no longer accepts certain dynamics. Great leaders, entrepreneurs, and strategists have always understood this. They don't ask permission to live their principles. They uphold the consequences. And curiously, the more a man stops chasing external validation, the more natural influence he begins to exert. Because genuine freedom has its own presence. But there's an even rarer stage after all that. A level where a man not only stops depending on the approval of the room, he stops needing the entire room. The most powerful man in the room is almost never the one desperately trying to prove his worth. He's usually the one who remains whole, even without needing anyone's approval. There's a stark difference between someone who possesses value and someone who begs for recognition. Machiavelli deeply understood that silent power is born from psychological independence. The man who constantly needs to be validated, desired, or accepted ends up becoming emotionally cheap, even if he has money, looks, or status. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that true perceived value is directly linked to emotional scarcity and inner completeness. Those who depend too much on the attention of others inevitably begin to mold themselves to maintain that attention. And at that moment, they lose authenticity, firmness, and presence. The valuable man doesn't force respect. He naturally conveys the feeling that his energy, his time, and his presence have weight. And this cannot be bought with catchy phrases or artificial arrogance. It is built silently through discipline, self-control, purpose, and the ability to be alone without emotionally collapsing. Observe truly influential people. They rarely seem desperate to impress. There's a calmness about them. There's a kind of absence of emotional urgency. And this deeply affects human perception. Because the man who doesn't chase attention transmits something rare, inner abundance. Better to be feared than loved, in many cases, simply means not appearing needy. The person who tries to please everyone in the room loses strength immediately. But the man who manages to remain true to his own identity, even at the risk of not being understood, gains psychological depth. A simple example appears in dating, business, and even friendships. The emotionally cheap man immediately responds to any crumb of attention, accepts any condition, and lives trying to prove himself. The valuable man, however, doesn't compromise his principles for momentary validation. This doesn't mean playing childish emotional games. It simply means not abandoning oneself to keep someone around. Virtù and fortuna favor those who learn to build emotional stability before seeking external approval. And curiously, the more complete a man becomes on his own, the more magnetic his presence becomes to others. But there's an even deeper layer to all of this. The discerning man isn't just selective with others, he's also selective with himself. He takes care of his body, mind, finances, posture, communication, and the environments he frequents because he understands that his life needs to reflect value before demanding external recognition. His own loyal armies begin within his own mind. The calculated use of force appears when he learns to say no, even to destructive impulses that sabotage his growth. While many live seeking emotional shortcuts, empty distractions, and instant validation, he invests in silent construction. He reads books that expand his worldview, learns new skills, strengthens physical discipline, and develops emotional intelligence. Because he understands that genuine completeness cannot be bought, manipulated, or imitated for long. The appearance of virtue without essence, sooner or later, crumbles. And that's exactly why some people enter any environment and immediately seem different, even without saying almost anything. They don't carry despair in their eyes. They don't carry neediness in their posture. They don't carry a constant fear of being abandoned. They learned something that completely changes the dynamics of human power. The man who doesn't need the room inevitably becomes the hardest to replace within it. Now, understand something that almost no one dares to admit. Many people spend their entire lives trying to be chosen, when they should be building such a solid life that they don't need to beg for anyone's support. Machiavelli understood that true power has never been solely in physical strength, money, or status. True power has always been in the ability to control one's own mind, while the rest of the world reacts emotionally to everything. Because the man who sells himself cheaply loses authority. The man who over-explains loses mystery. And the man who never sets limits inevitably becomes an emotional resource for others, not a respected presence. Perhaps some of these truths have bothered you, and honestly, that's a good sign, because growth rarely begins in comfort. It begins the moment a person realizes they are living below their own worth. How many times have you accepted less than you deserved simply for fear of losing someone? How many times have you been too available to people who would never do the same for you? How many times have you over-explained your decisions because you desperately needed to be understood? Politics guided by reality, not ideals, demands facing these questions without running away from them. Because as long as you continue to operate out of a need for approval, you will continue to give emotional power to anyone who knows how to manipulate your neediness. But from the moment you begin to build silence, boundaries, discipline, independence, and presence, something profoundly changes. You stop chasing. You stop begging for space. You stop diminishing yourself to fit into small environments. And curiously, the less need you demonstrate, the more respect you naturally begin to generate. Better to be feared than loved has never meant living like an arrogant tyrant. It simply means not allowing your dignity to be cheaply consumed by others. Virtù and fortuna favor men who can maintain firmness, even when the world tries to break them emotionally. And few manage to do that today. So now I want to ask you something. Which of these 7 principles resonated with you the most? In what area of your life do you realize you're still selling yourself short without noticing? And most importantly, what would change in your life if you finally learned to assert yourself without guilt? Write that in the comments, because sometimes the first change begins exactly the moment you decide to stop lying to yourself. And if you want to continue learning about psychological power, strategy, human nature, and Machiavelli's most brutal teachings applied to modern life, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because the next videos will show things that most people spend their entire lives without understanding until it's too late.